So, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the latest in our series of webinars aimed at keeping you connected and informed during this period of lockdown. As you can see, this one is entitled Hit Return, answering your individual and career questions as England goes back to work. I should stress that whilst it says England, I mean, the points that we'll be discussing today are pertinent to the entire UK. I see that, believe that plans are being made for Scotland to go back to work as well, albeit on a different timescale, and I'm sure the same will apply in Northern Ireland and Wales too. Okay. Today, I'm delighted that we have with us, I hope most of you know who I am, Steve Nash, Chief Executive of the IMI. Delighted we have our Head of Membership Products and Services with us, Mark Armitage, who I think is also very well known to you. And I'm also extremely delighted we have Kelly Gibson, who's Head of Employment Law at Taylor and Emmet, who provide legal services to us. So welcome to both of you. Great to have you here. Let me just talk you through the agenda. I've done the introductions, obviously. We're going to talk a bit about support and guidance for those furloughed and working, and then some more details around the furlough scheme and basically the implications of going back to work. And there are many, and both the practical and the legal implications. Give you a chance to ask some questions. You'll see that you can do that throughout anyway, so please feel free to submit your questions to us and I'll make sure we field those as we go through. And let's look forward to a good debate. So without further ado, welcome Mark and Kelly. Great to have you both here.
Morning, Steve.
Morning, Kelly.
Morning, hi.
Morning. Perhaps we can kick off by, first of all, Mark, perhaps you could explain what our furlough register is. That's something we've recently initiated.
Yeah, no problem at all, Steve. Those of you that are members of the IMI will know we have a professional register. We have some 75,000 individuals that are members of the IMI currently around the world. And at the early stages of the pandemic coming through, we decided we would want to try and help support the sector as best we can, being a professional body for the sector. So we started a few surveys, and one of those was to try and see the impact of organisations and individuals working in the sector and whether they were still actively working or unfortunately furloughed. So we sent out a number of surveys. Some people on this webinar today may have completed these or may also have been impacted by furlough. And it was really interesting to see the information coming through. Probably not too surprising that about 62% of people that responded stated that their organisation was already or was planning to be furloughing individuals, and around 51% of the people that had actually filled the survey in were currently in a furloughed position. So, you know, that's a large number of people around the sector that suddenly find themselves at home, as we all are at the moment, or a lot of us are, and trying to probably think about what to do. So we took the opportunity to support those people and to engage them in a register where we could provide access to learning material, career advice and all those kind of things. So we've got a large number of people currently active on that register that we're engaged with, that we're providing information for and giving them access to learning as kind of the second bullet.
Do you want to say a little bit about the next point on the agenda? And do you want to say a little bit more about the access to learning, the sort of resources that are available?
Yeah, definitely. And there's I think what we've seen over the last 8 weeks is people that had a digital platform or that were thinking of having a digital platform have certainly maximised it or accelerated their opportunity to go digital. We do have, as IMI, we have some digital resources ourselves, but as some of you know, we've got around 600 training centres that also provide information and support to the sector. So it's been great to see so many of you engaging in digital learning. We're also working hard around other elements there, and it isn't always about technical. Technical is a big piece of the sector, but actually from a management perspective, or particularly from a well-being perspective, there's an awful lot of support out there, either from us directly or through our IMI centres. And as I say, it's been really good to see so many of you sharing that story that people are still accessing learning. What was interesting, Steve, was in the survey, it was clear that particularly in the early days, people weren't 100% aware of the rules around furlough and that you could still engage in learning, particularly for apprentices, for example.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think a lot got sort of caught out with that in the early stages, where maybe an apprentice had been furloughed and a college had to close due to government's kind of direction. And it took a few days or weeks for people to get up and running. But I think it's still important even today to be sharing that message that you can still engage in learning, even if you're furloughed.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of earning, there have been some questions that we've fielded from individuals concerning, particularly around apprenticeships, and national minimum wage and all the rest of it, and how that's affected in furlough. Maybe Kelly, that's something you might want to comment on.
Yes, Steve. So the position is that apprentices normally have the national minimum wage for apprentices. Obviously, they can be paid more if their employer can afford to do that. Whilst apprentices are furloughed, as with everybody else, their employer can reduce pay to 80% of their normal pay. But as apprentices are being encouraged to carry out training whilst they're furloughed, for any period of time that they are training, they must still be paid at least the national minimum wage for apprentices. So for example, if for 2 days a week they're training, they should get paid their normal full pay or the national minimum wage at least for those 2 days. And for the other 3 days, perhaps where they're not working, then they would potentially still just get the 80%.
Okay, now that's good clarification. Thank you. And I'm sure, that will be useful information for a number of people. Mark, the other issue we've had, obviously, I mean, I know we've been doing an awful lot, and your team particularly, to keep students engaged, to keep, so where people particularly coming up towards, if they're students towards their endpoint assessment, or if they're, if they're apprentices towards their endpoint assessment, if they're students maybe towards the end of their program where they're waiting to be assessed. Just talk a little bit about, what's in place regarding remote assessment.
Yeah, I mean, remote assessment technology, it's a big area of focus for me personally and for the IMI, and has been for a period of time. And as you mentioned, Steve, there are kind of two camps here. So one specifically in England are learners or apprentices that are on an apprenticeship standard that require an endpoint assessment. This time of year is typically where learners are coming through to achieve their apprenticeship or their qualification. So, if it could have ever happened at a different time, but we've got massive volumes of people that have had their learning interrupted, which has been a real shame. And what we don't want to do is disadvantage any learners. So myself and my teams and other teams around the IMI have been heavily engaged with regulators, Ofqual in particular for England, and also the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education with regards to apprenticeship standards. And that's resulted in a couple of things. So if we think about endpoint assessment and apprenticeship standards, that's where we've got we've got plans in place already, and we've got agreements with the relevant government agencies already. That happened relatively quickly during April. It did show a bit of a spike in our EPA activity. I think we only put 3 apprentices through any form of EPA activity in April. And actually one of those was a furloughed member of staff on a motor finance specialist route, first one in the country, and we did it all remotely. So I think that was amazing, and that individual actually came out with a distinction. So, yeah, you know, it'd be amazing for that individual to be able to get through their assessment process. Now that we've got those agreements in place.
Sorry, Mark, I was going to say there is this temporary regulation framework coming through, isn't there, that is imminent, which which will be the next couple of months, I believe.
Yeah, so just to close off the EPA side, that's all in place now. On our website, we've got a full list of the 18 routes that we offer and the agreed adaptions that are in place. We've put 60 individuals through remote online tests in the last couple of weeks, which is great because they're going through the process now of gaining their apprenticeship certificate. Yeah. So the temporary regulation framework, to move on to that, that's fundamentally around qualifications, and volumes on that are massive. We're talking about 40 to 50,000 learners that are currently awaiting to finish their qualifications at the moment. Yeah. Now, we've been working for what seems like forever, but I think it's about 6 weeks now with the regulators on this framework. There was a consultation which was open up until the 8th of May, which I know a number of people on this webinar and around our member base and the sector contributed to. And that framework goes live, as in being published by Ofqual on Friday of this week. Right. Is the plan. So on Friday, there'll be very clear guidelines from the regulator around the 3 key categorizations of qualifications in the short term. And as you mentioned, Steve, this is a temporary solution. It will only run until the end of July, which means we've had to kind of clear the decks for our staff to make sure for the next 2 months they're fully going to be engaged and supporting learners and centres to get them through to the end of their qualification. Yeah. We've actually got another webinar next week, which will be specifically getting into a lot of detail around that. So that's next Wednesday. So anybody that is working in that area, you need to get on that webinar. It'll be the quality and product team talking about the detail. But fundamentally, there'll be 3 categories. One's estimation, similar to what they're doing with GCSEs and functional skills and A-levels. We only have a few qualifications that sit in there, and our full list of qualifications will also be released at the end of this week, explaining clearly what you can and can't do on the different qualification. But so there's only a few qualifications, there's a couple of thousand learners sit on those that we need to work with centres to get through an estimated result. A big part will be adaptation, where we'll be applying adapted solutions. Remote invigilation of online tests will be a big one of those. So we have all the processes and everything in place to get training centres trained up, approved to deliver online tests. And, you know, there's a lot of people out there that will only maybe need 1 or 2 online tests to finish their qualification, which would be great to get them through the process. The final bit is around delay. And this is where predominantly there's some levels of practical or skills assessments that really can't be simulated or done remotely. We know the government are kind of pushing, advising colleges and education organisations to get back up and running from June, which is only kind of 2 weeks away. So we are also very clear that we're going to need to be working closely with those people. And if you're a training organisation on the call, on the webinar today in our sector, I'm sure you're already busily looking at your schedule, wondering, how do I get all of these people through practical skills assessments before we kind of get to what, in a college environment, typically September's enrolment of new starts, not dealing with people that should have been finished by kind of June. So
I saw Gillian Keegan, the minister, this morning made a comment about this and saying that she's really urging further education colleges and other educational establishments to take the opportunity to kind of get things moving in June, because if nothing else, it gets the processes in place they're going to need come the new academic year, and it gets them off to a quicker start when that comes along. So yeah, I mean, you're spot on there, Mark, really.
Yeah, and I think that probably leads into, Steve, the next part around, you know, how do you get back in a facility that's maybe been empty for the last 6 weeks.
Well, that's true, and those of you who look at our website regularly will know that last week we published a guide that was jointly put together by ourselves and a number of the trade associations, who all have a kind of joint interest in what the implications are of opening up premises and getting people back to work. And it's the aim of that is to provide some useful and pragmatic guidance on what employers need to do to provide a safe working environment for their employees, for their customers, and so on. And what you should expect actually reasonably as an employee. You can go into massive detail around things. I mean, there are various versions of that. We've concentrated on where our members are, which is an awful lot of our members are in the automotive retail side and service and repair operations, as well as sales and so on. If you get into manufacturing, there are pages and pages on just what you need to do around catering. And in most cases, we've said, actually, that's probably something you don't really want to get into in the short term. Just provide some safe places for people to be and let them bring a sandwich in or whatever. But let me come on to the next slide, because I think this kind of opens up some more issues around the employment side. And Kelly, I mean, obviously a week or two back, the Chancellor announced that the job retention scheme, as it's called, the furloughing of people, will now go on all the way through to October, with some changes to come in July. Do you want to just comment on that a little bit?
Yes, absolutely. So we had the announcements a couple of weeks ago that the coronavirus job retention scheme will continue until the end of October. For now, until the end of July, there will be no changes. So everything can continue in the same way as it is now. People can be furloughed, they can be brought back from furlough until the end of July. From the 1st of August to the end of October, the furlough scheme will continue, but there are going to be some changes made. Now, at this point, we don't know exactly what they will be. We are expecting a further announcement before the end of May. But what the government have suggested is that they will be encouraging businesses to start opening back up, for people to go back in on a part-time basis, and that potentially the government is going to reduce their contribution to furlough pay. So at the moment, the government is covering 80% of salary, but from the 1st of August, I suspect that percentage will reduce down. Employers will have to contribute a higher percentage if employees remain furloughed, or there will be an allowance, whereas at the moment you're not allowed to do any work at all if you're furloughed. From the 1st of August, I suspect there will be some sort of allowance whereby people can work either a certain number of hours and still have a top-up of pay from the government. But it's a bit of a watch this space scenario for now.
Yeah, I saw something, actually, some research that was done, which indicated that up to 2/3 of people who are on furlough have concerns about job security, and whether or not they'll actually ever get back to their workplace. If people find themselves in those unfortunate situations, what sort of steps can they take, or what kind of advice would you give to people who find themselves possibly concerned about their job security, or even told that they aren't going to be going back?
Well, I think this is a sort of a big picture. There potentially are going to be redundancy situations in various businesses across the country. Depending on the type of organisation you are in and how quickly business picks up will affect that. But I think the important thing for employees is to engage with the process. So the first thing an employer should do is put people at risk of redundancy. If that's a possibility, they need to put people at risk and start a consultation. And depending on how many proposed redundancies there might be, will affect how long that consultation period has to be. If there's more than 20 proposed redundancies, that consultation period has to be a minimum of 30 days. If that number is 100 or more, then it's a 45-day period of consultation. Right. But really, employees need to start thinking creatively. So employers have to consider as many alternatives to redundancy as they can. And the kind of things that would be relevant would be reducing people's hours, so going down to a 3 or 4 day working week, perhaps, whether temporarily or permanently. Pay cuts is an option. You know, it's not a nice one. Nobody wants to have their pay cut, but if the option is be made redundant or take a pay cut for a while, then that's an option. People can look at things like job sharing. You know, at the moment, with a lot of people working from home, they might have realised that they don't want to work quite so many hours. Maybe their colleague thinks the same. If they can say, well, 2 of us could be 1 full-time equivalent, that's an option. Just other things as well, flexible working, home working, anything that might reduce overheads or reduce costs. Companies might have to look at things like removal of benefits. So if as an employee you can think of options for your employer that would prevent them from having to make people redundant, then you should really engage with that process as early as you can.
Yeah, sure. One of the other questions that we've been asked by individual members is the issue of holiday, and you know, can I take holiday whilst I'm on whilst I'm being furloughed, or can I be made to take holiday whilst I'm being furloughed? And you know, what are the implications if I don't get back into the workplace until sometime later in the year? You know, do I still have my full holiday allowance? All those kind of questions. And you know, anything you can tell us on that, Kelly?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll try and break it down. So first of all, whilst a person is on furlough leave, they are still accruing holiday as they would if they were in work. So your entitlement to holiday continues to accrue. You're not losing that holiday by being on furlough leave, unless your employer has asked you to agree to a change in the accrual rate or something like that. Can you take holiday? Well, yes, if you want to request holiday, then you can certainly request it. And if your employer agrees, you just take holiday as you normally would. One of the reasons people on furlough leave might want to do that is because you should be paid 100% of your salary for any period you're on holiday, as opposed to the potential 80% whilst you're on furlough leave. Now, employers can turn down requests for holiday, and they might do that if, for example, they're having a cash flow problem. So whilst it might be beneficial to the employee to be paid 100%, that employer might not be able to top that 20% up. So that might be a reason why they might refuse it. But in principle, yes, you can take holiday. Now, in terms of whether an employer can make you take holiday during a period of furlough leave, in principle, yes, they can. There are minimum notice provisions set out in the working time regulations. So if an employer wants you to take 2 days holiday, they have to give you double the amount of notice of the number of days holiday. So they'd have to give you 4 days notice that they wanted you to take holiday. Now there's a question which comes back to the very crux of holiday. Holiday is there to make sure people are getting paid time off to relax and have some time away from work. And there's some questions about whether people can really relax and rest whilst they're on furlough leave, especially, you know, up until a couple of weeks ago where we were quite strictly locked down. You were only allowed to leave the house once a day for essential exercise, that sort of thing. I think now that lockdown's been loosened, though, I think there's more of an argument that people are able to rest and relax. They're able to leave the house for longer periods of time if it's to get exercise or whatever. So I think that argument falls away a little bit. Now, for some people, there's going to be an argument there that actually furlough leave is very stressful for whatever reason, or the idea of leaving the house is very stressful. Perhaps they're in a high risk category or something like that. And I think for those people, they've got more of an argument that they can't be made to take holiday whilst on furlough leave because they won't get the benefit, they won't get that rest and relaxation period. So I can't give you a specific answer there, Steve, but I think there are certainly, in principle, yes, you can take holiday, and yes, you can be made to take holiday.
I think some of the things that we've heard that some employers are doing, and this actually applies not just to people who are furloughed, but maybe where people are still working, but have limited opportunity to take a holiday at the moment. I mean, there's not many places until very recently. It wasn't really anywhere to go, was there? But I know that some employers, that includes us actually, one of the things we've done is we've said to people, actually they can they're allowed to roll more holiday over. We're going to roll holiday over for a couple of years so that you don't have that situation where everybody comes back to work and then all of a sudden everybody goes off on holiday. You know, that we allow that to be spread out so they're not worried about losing that entitlement. And that's perhaps for any employers listening might be something to consider, you know, that sort of extended rollover, which it probably needs to be more than 1 year so that you can kind of flatten out that curve a little bit. But I think another question that is on a lot of people's minds is, I mean, people fall into lots of different camps. There are people who are literally gagging to get back to work, and that's understandable. I mean, for all sorts of reasons, either because they're climbing the walls at home or because they're just keen to kind of get back and established in their job. But there are also people who have concerns. You know, what sort of environment am I going back into? You know, and there have been instances that we've heard of people saying, "Well, refusing to go." What are people's rights around that in terms of, you know, if they have any concerns about what they're going back into, the kind of preparations that have been made for their safety and so on?
Well, as a starting point, the principle is if you've been furloughed and you're asked to go back to work, you have to go back to work. If you refuse to go back to work, then your employer doesn't have to pay you because you're not ready, willing and able to attend work. And that's part of the basic employment contract. You work for pay. Furlough has, you know, put a temporary measure in there, and most furlough agreements that I've certainly drafted and ones that I've seen say within that, you know, whilst we'll try to give you reasonable notice, you need to return to work as soon as you're asked to do so. Yeah. However, that can be slightly different if the reason a person doesn't want to go back to work is because they're concerned for their health and safety. So that's a slightly different position. Now, for me, what I would want to see employers doing is as soon as they're inviting employees back to work, I would want them to be giving them those reassurances of the measures they've put in place to protect health and safety. So ideally, you know, telling them that social distancing is in place, that workstations are spaced out properly, that there's additional PPE or sanitation spaces and that sort of thing. So if an employer is giving you that reassurance, then you need to be turning up for work on day one. I'll put that there for just a second. If your employer doesn't give you those reassurances, then as an employee, I think you do have to ask those questions and start that conversation yourself. You know, there should be some dialogue there. So if you're not told those things without prompting, then ask, you know, what's in place? What can I expect? What do you want me to do? You know, has anything changed?
Yeah.
Assuming that you get those assurances, you need to go to work, turn up to work, and if everything's fine, then you need to work and you'll get paid for that work and carry on as normal, or the new normal as it's currently called. However, if you turn up for work having had these assurances and your employer hasn't put those measures in places, perhaps they're expecting you to work too closely with other people, or they haven't put PPE in place, then at that point, I think it's reasonable for you to say to your employer, look, I don't feel safe here. I don't think you've put appropriate measures in place. And unless you do that now, I'm going to leave the premises for the day. And then I want reassurance that those measures will be put in place before I come back. Sure. Now, a lot of people have been talking about Section 44 of the Employment Rights Act in the last week or two. I think outside of employment law, nobody had really heard of that before 2 weeks ago, but it's
I read it every night. Yeah.
It's everybody's favourite piece of legislation right now. And what Section 44 says is that you can't be treated badly if you refuse to work or you leave work in circumstances where you consider and you hold a reasonable belief that there is serious or imminent danger. So that's why I think people have to at least turn up on the day if they've been told it's safe to do so, because I don't think you can hold a reasonable belief until you come in and see what the circumstances are. But if you do walk into a workplace and you think there is a serious and imminent threat to your health and safety or to somebody else's, then at that point, potentially you can refuse to work. Now, what I would say is that you should address that with somebody on site before you leave, if you can, and make it very clear that you're raising a health and safety concern, and possibly put that in writing before you leave site as well. You know, as an employee, you need to be thinking about this in a worst case and long-term scenario, if you have to prove why you left work on that day to an employment tribunal, can you? So put it in writing, and if you can't, go home and send them an email. Create that evidence trail from the very beginning.
It's right, isn't it, that as well? I mean, the Health and Safety Executive have given some guidelines on what a risk assessment should look like from an employer's point of view, have they not? In terms of, so the kind of things you should be looking at in terms of making the workplace safe for people to come back into.
Yes, absolutely. There's a general obligation on all employers to have a risk assessment in place anyway. And employers are expected to update that risk assessment at any point that it would be relevant to do so. And certainly the current circumstances for me would be a time to update that risk assessment. As you said, Steve, the HSE have given guidance on that, but I would expect employers to be considering things like spacing of workstations, PPE, sanitation stations. Are there additional hand washing facilities? Antibacterial hand gel, that sort of stuff, setting out what they've thought about, what the risks are, and what measures they've put in place to.
There are some good examples on the internet. Actually, I've seen that a number of the big dealer groups have put pieces out on the internet which demonstrate for employees and customers the kind of measures that they can expect to see when they arrive at the premises. And it's all the kind of thing you're talking about, where it may be everything from perspex screens to spacing on the floor to hand sanitizer in the right places and all that kind of thing, and obviously one-way systems for people to come in and leave the premises. And it will have implications, I guess, particularly in the short term for the numbers of people that you can perhaps bring back. But then I guess that's what the second phase of furlough is about. It's recognizing the fact that you can't necessarily bring everybody back on day one, because you've got to get the business running again, and that will hopefully help people to kind of ramp the business back up to the point where they can get more people in. I think that the other point, and Mark, you might want to throw some comments in on this as well. I mean, because your team certainly are affected by this. There's also that issue of some people are required as part of their job to visit third-party premises, whether that's a customer's premises or that could be delivery drivers or whatever. But are there any particular elements that apply there?
Yeah, definitely. And thanks, Kelly. I think you've given everybody on this webinar and in the future in our sector some great advice around as an employee, but also as an employer. I'm sure there's some people sat there thinking, have I done everything I need to do, or are there a couple of bits I need to finish off? As an employer, from IMI's perspective, most of you will probably be aware that Fanshaw's, our main office, has kind of been empty since the lockdown started, and we're currently looking at plans to reopen from July. So there's a lot of work going on, similarly to what you've spoke about, Steve, about how we manage work flow of people through the building, and how we make sure that all the facilities are safe and secure. So I know our facilities team are busily updating our risk assessments as we're here today. But you're quite right in your observation around people that have to travel around, and we have a number of teams in the business that go in and out of employer and training providers' premises, and that's generally their day-to-day operation. It's all been done through Zoom and remote technology for the last 8 weeks, but we know that as those organisations are reopening from June, there's going to be activities that we cannot do remotely. So the field-based teams are just finalising a risk assessment for that, and it's really interesting the bits that you start to think about, not just asking the other organisation, can we see your risk assessment, but actually there's a whole load of travel required before you even get there. So how do we make sure that your employee understands how to stay safe when they're on their journey? If they have to go to a petrol station or a service station or stop off somewhere else, what happens if they have a puncture or something like that? So we've had to be really clear as an employer to flag all those potential risks and what mitigating actions we'd expect people to take.
I think the guide that I talked about earlier on, and there are links to all of this stuff that will be shown later that you can access. But you know, yeah, and those are sort of concerns we've heard about. You know, you know, how do you make cars safe? Both so if you're an employee of a business where you're required to get in and out of different cars throughout the day, how is the car made safe for you to get into, and how is the car made safe to give back to the customer, and that sort of thing. And there are a lot of practical steps that can be taken. I mean, bearing in mind that, you know, actually it's good practice anyway to have protective gear around the car, because you don't want, you know, you want to protect the customer's interior and steering wheel and so on. But there are some sensible extra processes around that, I believe, aren't there? And you know, we've tried to make sure that those are encapsulated in that document.
Yeah. And with regards to our own risk assessment, we will be publicising it. We know that a number of our members and training partners will have similar challenges. So, you know, sharing best practice is I think a real positive out of the current situation. You know, how can we help each other move forward and keep all of the sector safe? And I think on the point of the whole facility and secureness, I mentioned earlier we have a framework webinar next week. We also have a facility webinar next week. So there are 2 webinars running next week that will really get into some of the detail on those 2 points.
Yeah, indeed. I think that we've you know, we've seen, as I say, we've seen some good examples from out there in the business. I think at the moment, Kelly, we've talked about people going back to work, and that's particularly pertinent in England at the moment. Although I have heard Nicola Sturgeon talking about, you know, planning similar things, albeit a little further down the line. But they're certainly starting to talk about opening things up a bit, and I'm sure the other home nations will follow suit. I think that there is this. Service and repair operations were in an exempted category, weren't they? So they were allowed to stay open all the way through the lockdown, on the understanding that they would be looking after, you know, essential workers and so on. And I think, I mean, what we saw in the early stages was a limited amount of capacity being kept going. But actually, as of now, I mean, I think we're seeing almost, as far as is possible, a kind of step back towards normal. I've heard a lot of the big dealer groups saying that they're pretty much getting most of that capacity back online. But there are other elements like sales, for example, which were categorized as non-essential retail. So whilst some online selling's been allowed, there was even discussion about whether you could deliver those cars. I think the sort of that's been clarified a little now. But I know that there are preparations in place for, you know, a lot of the big groups are now looking to get sales up and running again as soon as they're allowed to, which they're anticipating won't be long. What are your thoughts around that, Kelly, in terms of sort of retail in general, in particular automotive retail? You know, how soon we think the government might allow that to get going again?
I think it all depends on how people behave in the current lockdown situation, and whether we see another spike in coronavirus cases, really, and whether they decide to lock us down a bit further, or whether they continue to relax the lockdown gradually. But I think sales and things will start to open back up, albeit there may be numbers on limits on the number of people you can have in you know, in a retail space in one go, and that will be both employees and customers. One of the things that you might see is longer opening hours with people working shifts or something like that, so that you can try and get more people in, but over a longer period of time, so there's less people in at any one time. Again, I think I mentioned it earlier, I think it's a time for people to be creative if they're running a business, and a time for employees to try and go with that flexible approach, to try and get their earnings back up and that sort of thing. So you know, some industries are saying that people will just be coming back on a rota, like alternate days with a deep clean in between. Others are saying that they'll extend opening hours and maybe start working from 7 instead of 9 and finishing at 7 instead of 5 or something, just to get their employees back in and allow customers to come in smaller volumes at any one time.
Well, I think Mark would attest to the fact. I mean, we've had our entire workforce kind of working remotely, but I think that, as you say, the creative piece is. I think most people have learned what is possible to do when you're not in your normal premises, and that's that kind of new normal that you referred to, I think, Kelly, isn't it? You know, the fact that actually, I mean, we've certainly looked at what we've learned from this, and how that will affect us as and whenever that may be, we're able to access the premises again, and we certainly wouldn't be able to get all the people back into the premises that we normally have back in the premises. So that sort of general flexibility around the way people work, still having some people working at home and so on, is going to be critical. I think that as well, I mean, until people are actually able to sort out childcare and things like that, you know, that's slowly changing back, but only on quite a limited level, isn't it? You know, so people who've got children who would normally put them in daycare or whatever, but that's not available to them. You know, I think it's incumbent upon employers to be flexible around that, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think there was some reluctance with some employers before to allow remote working and flexible working. And I think that excuse has gone out the window with this. You know, people have proved that they can work from home, that they can do the work in a more flexible way, not necessarily between their normal working hours. And I think certainly from an employment law perspective, employees have the right to make a flexible working request once a year. You're only allowed to make one once every 12 months. But you can ask to change the location of where you work, the hours that you work, whether that's just the time of day that you work or the number of hours that you work. And if employers are not being as flexible as they can be, then employees can make that request. And whilst they don't have the right to have it granted, employers do need to think carefully if they're going to refuse a flexible working request. And I think given that people have shown that they can work in certain ways, unless there's been a significant problem, employers are going to find it harder to turn down flexible working requests.
Kelly, we've had a question come in, which may well be the last one we get to cover, actually, given the time limits, but it's a really interesting one, actually. And it's, if we are able to travel at some point, but there is 14-day quarantine in place on return, can my employer stop me going or not pay me for 2 weeks when I return?
That is quite an interesting question, actually. I think realistically, if you're going to book a 2-week holiday and you know that when you come back there's going to be a 2-week quarantine, if you can't work from home, then you're going to have to get into an agreement with your employer, either that you're going to take a 4-week holiday, 2 weeks will be abroad and 2 weeks of it will be in the UK, or that you're going to take a 2-week holiday and 2 weeks of unpaid leave or something like that. There's certainly, employers are not going to be under a duty to pay people while they're in quarantine if they've chosen to go abroad.
Yeah. No, good. That's, yeah, but you know, it's a fair question in the circumstances, isn't it? You know, and because these are all the new things that we're having to deal with. You know, I think that kind of flips back to the question about holiday, isn't it? Is where the hell do you go? Because you know, we're not going to. It's hard to go abroad for the reasons we just talked about, and you know, you've got areas of the UK, Lake District and Cornwall and whatever, saying please don't come here, you know, and you're not supposed to cross the Welsh border at the moment, and all those kind of things. It's yeah, and very, very interesting times, and I think you know, I think we're yeah, we're definitely into some interesting territory here. Mark, I think that you know, I mean, your team have been pretty much fully engaged, haven't they, through the lockdown? You know, perhaps you sort of talk a little bit about, you know, some of the activities that have kept them busy.
Yeah, I mean, the quite a diverse area that I'm involved with, from developing products, developing e-learning, through to the compliance, or the interesting stuff, working with regulators and compliance, and also our assessment and endpoint assessment activities. But I think I mentioned earlier, April for the assessment team was heavily involved in. I think they did about 92 remote engagements, and it's not a team of 100 people. You know, it's a relatively modest team, but they did about 92 engagements, a lot with regulators and government bodies, to get us to a place where we could re-engage on remote assessments. And then during this month now, they're pretty much most days doing remote invigilation of online tests, professional discussions for apprenticeship standards. And we've actually just yesterday had our first request from a training centre saying, we're opening up in June. We'd like to still plan to go ahead with practical skills tests, albeit under the relevant social distancing measures. So probably lower volume of people over a longer period of time. And I think that's a big point for people to note, is your schedule's likely to get heavily impacted by the volume of individuals you can put through a facility at any one time. So that's been a big area for the assessment team. From the quality team point of view, you know, we're still doing audits with centres, we're still doing support visits with centres, and it hasn't really dropped off, Steve. You know, we have a team of about 10 quality assurers, and they're doing 4 to 5 visits remotely a week. So we're continuing to support those centres, and it's interesting. It's very much like we are today. There's a quality assurer sat at home somewhere in the UK, and training centre staff sat at home anywhere in the world. We've done a lot of training with some new centre staff over in China. You know, and it's kind of, I think Kelly mentioned earlier, we've used remote technology for a couple of years in one guise or another, but to run it day in, day out like we are today, you know, it's proving there's a place for it. And certainly myself and the teams are looking at the future and seeing how we can have more of a blended solution with this remote technology to support everybody, really, to be more efficient.
It's funny, actually. I mean, Zoom was something that you and the business, your guys and the business development team used to talk about quite a bit, I knew about it. I didn't really know what it was. So, I mean, it's now so much part of our life. It's crazy, isn't it?
It's a daily occurrence now.
Kelly, what if someone were to go back to work and get infected, which is clearly a risk. I mean, while this dreadful virus is still around, none of us can be complacent about it, and even with reasonable measures taken. But if it's not entirely impossible that somebody could pick up the infection. They might not know where they picked it up necessarily, but what sort of rights would they have if they thought that they picked it up at work?
Well, theoretically, an individual could try and bring a personal injury claim against their employer, but I think you hit the nail on the head already, Steve. Is proving that you got that infection in the workplace is going to be very, very difficult. Your employer owes you a duty of care to make sure that they are not putting you at risk, but people can be asymptomatic. If the company's put measures in place and somebody comes in and they don't know they've got coronavirus and it somehow gets passed on, I think it will be very difficult for an employee to prove that they contracted the virus at work. It's a difficult one. I'm not really sure what they can do on a practical level. They might want to speak to their employer about making sure that they're paid, asking if they can be paid full pay if they've got a good reason to say that they got it from work. They're not going anywhere else and whatever, and they think it's their employer's fault, but whether employers are going to agree to that's a completely different question.
Yeah. It's, by the way, Mark, you're pleased to see that Russell Hill has commented that he says we had a remote external quality assurance last week and it was all perfectly fine. And yeah, it's amazing what we can do remotely, isn't it? I think it'll definitely change the shape of the workplace. I think that I mean, Kelly, what sort of stuff are you seeing? You know, when you you're dealing. This is what you do on a daily basis, isn't it? You know, what are the sort of typical questions that you're getting, you know, around employment in these current circumstances?
Some of the ones we've answered today, actually, a lot of questions about holiday, more from employers than employees. You know, the employers are concerned that if staff are off work for 3, 6, 8 months, they're going to have built up a lot of holiday, and asking whether or not they can ask their employees to take it. And the general approach seems to be that employers are asking staff to take maybe a day or two's holiday every month, that they're furloughed, just to reduce the amount of holiday they'll have at the end of that furlough leave period.
And to be clear, Kelly, that's a request, isn't it? That's not something an employer can necessarily force, is it? Or is it?
I think in the first instance they should request, and some employers are saying, you know, we'd like you to take, you're going to be off work for 4 months. By the time you return, we'd like you to take a week. It's up to you when you take that. Some employers are just saying the last 2 days of every month are going to be holiday. We're giving you notice of that, and they can do that, as I mentioned earlier, subject to potentially people saying, well, I can't rest and relax whilst I'm on furlough leave. We did have a lot more questions at the beginning. You know, people have settled into it now. People understand furlough a bit better. We're getting some questions, again, generally from employers, about what constitutes pay, what elements of pay fall into the 80% that can be claimed back from the government and things like that.
Well, that's particularly relevant in our sector because there are a lot of people, I mean, clearly a lot of salespeople who work on a low basic and high commission, perhaps. There are people, technicians who typically their take-home pay would include overtime and bonuses, which and yeah, there has been a lot of questions around. Just for clarity, what is the situation around that?
So it does depend. If a person is salaried, or if a person earns the same amount every week, even on an hourly rate, then it will be 80% of what they get as their normal pay. If they do overtime every now and then, that won't be included. It will just be based on their normal pay. If a person does earn bonuses and commission and things like, they have what's called guaranteed overtime. So guaranteed overtime is where if your employer says there'll be 5 hours of overtime every month and you must do that, but we'll tell you when those 5 hours are, then that has to be included. Commission's a difficult one, and I think the position is, but don't quote me on this because it does change depending on circumstances. I think generally you have to look at average pay over the 12 weeks before to work out what sort of normal pay is. But there's been all sorts of different ways of calculating it for people, like looking at what they earned a year ago versus now, looking at average pay over the last year, and it's all very circumstance specific.
Yeah, and it's capped at £2,500, isn't it?
It is. So it's 80% of pay or £2,500 per month, and that's the net amount. Yeah. So it's what, the employer can also claim back pension contributions at the auto enrolment level, which is 3%. So they should continue to pay those, and the employer can claim back their national insurance contributions as well.
That's great. Thank you for that. Mark, just while we have a little bit of time left, do you just want to say something? I know it's been well publicised, but for anybody who hasn't picked up on it, about remote assessments, not a remote assessment, sorry, the extension for people, so people who are accredited but are due to be re-accredited. We've given extensions. You just want to give an update on that?
Yeah, definitely. Those of you that have engaged in IMI accreditation in the past, either as an individual or a training provider will know that it's typically a 3-year license scheme, and then you come through to reaccredit. Back at actually before the lockdown was announced, we were starting to get a lot of individuals that were unable to travel to take their reaccreditation because of symptoms or self-isolating. So we were aware that having looked what was going on globally, this was likely to be a longer term challenge. So we applied an extension of 6 months onto that 3-year licence for any individual that would have expired in from the beginning of March through to the end of June, saying that we would monitor that as we went through, which we've done. And actually just this week, and the sort of communication that's going out this week, we've now extended that to include individuals due to expire up to the end of September. And I realised that we had a lot of feedback on a previous webinar where MOT tests have been given similar kind of treatment, but because of the challenges that we know we're going to have with footfall and getting volumes through, I think if we hadn't done anything and just left it up to June, then training providers would probably have been struggling to meet demand to ensure they can take people through. So I'm very hopeful this is the final adjustment, because it actually aligns that kind of 6 months. So people that would have been at the beginning of this phase in March will be coming up for renewal in September. So I think we're going to align it that way. We will still be monitoring it, and should situations change, then we could remove some of that and bring people in earlier, or hopefully not extend it again. I'm hoping by September people are up and running to some level of normality.
Indeed. We're running out of time. I'll get one final question for you, Kelly, actually. And actually, we did one of the webinars I did last week. We had an interesting question from a gentleman who said, very keen to get my business back up and running again, but I'm 75. How am I affected? So I guess the question relates to the fact that there are certain restrictions around people 70 and older, or anybody who's sort of deemed to be in a vulnerable category. And so how do people stand in those circumstances? Does that override any kind of get back to work if you can type of message?
I think the most excuse me. I think the most important thing is to look after your own health, and therefore that of other people. Obviously, people 70 and above have been categorised as high risk, and ultimately he needs to bear that in mind, that if he's out there meeting people, he's at a higher risk of contracting coronavirus than other people are, and then that puts pressure on the NHS. And so the bigger picture is that probably he shouldn't be opening his business back up, and he should just wait unless he's able to do that remotely, or depending on the size of his business, if he can get his staff back to work whilst he stays remotely, then that's a possibility. But really, the government guidance at the moment is if you're over 70, you should be shielding.
And if you're in a vulnerable category, you can get tested, actually, can't you? If you're over 65, you can, but only if you think you've got symptoms. So it's despite the legendary 100,000 or whatever it is a day, I think it's still they're still as rare as hen's teeth, aren't they? These testing facilities. Listen, we've kind of running out of time. What I do want to draw your attention to, thank you for those of you who've tuned in today, the various links we have here, including a number of the things we've referred to. There's our webinar page, which will tell you about other webinars coming up, some of which Mark has talked about. We've got links to key government information. We've got additional links on there that Kelly has provided, support for employees and employers and so on. And the guide that I talked about, if you want to look at that, to get some ideas about preparing to go back to work, that is there. And if I just move to the last slide, really, I want to say a big thanks to Mark, thank you, and a very big thanks to Kelly as well. I really appreciated your involvement today. Taylor and Emmet, as I said, are our solicitors, and as you'll see on this slide, as a member, you are entitled to 45 minutes per subject of legal advice from Taylor and Emmet. and the number is there. So if you have any concerns about your employment status and so on, you know, that's a service you might want to use. And on that, I'm going to say again, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Kelly. Very much appreciated. And
Thanks,
for all
Steve.
this potential.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thanks for
Thank you.
inviting me.
Enjoy the rest of your day, everybody. Take care.
Indeed.
Bye.